Morning, Professor Spooner. How are you today, Brian?
Good morning, Frank. Good to be back again.
Yes.
What's been on my mind this week is the way the profusion of information has completely changed our lives. We've been talking in one way or another for many sessions about the way everyday social life is changing.
Hmm.
But the introduction of the idea of fake news, which I think came from somebody who might be called a fake president to begin with,
Hmm.
um, doesn't get talked about very much. However, I was thinking this week that in the first half of my life, up until the 1970s or so, even though we were used to the idea of computers, nevertheless, we got all our information in the way we had before, and we chose our newspapers carefully, and and of course we listened to things like the BBC or WMMR or something like that. And then starting in the 1980s, I remember sending my first email message in 1986 to a different building on campus. But it wasn't really until the 1990s that everything exploded with the introduction of the World Wide Web. And there's been a steady but accelerating increase in the amount of information available whenever you want information about anything since then.
Hmm.
And we've talked a lot, I mean, not you and I, but in general, one talks a lot about the fact that if you want to know anything, all you do is you just have to ask Google. And my daughter bought me a Christmas present, which is a large mug for my coffee, on which it says, "I don't need Google. My father knows everything."
That's a good
But
one.
I mean, it's the point is that there is so much information about anything you want to know at the moment that whereas up until 30, 40 years ago, and probably 30 years ago, it was easy enough to know where to get the correct information. And now it's almost impossible to know where to get the correct information, because the variety of information about anything you want to know is so amazing that you've got to make your own choice. And of course, what most people do most of the time is they look for what they want to think, rather than what might be the most correct information.
Well,
So I think that our relationship to information has completely changed.
it's interesting that you're saying this. The New York Times Sunday Magazine section this morning has a lengthy article on Rupert Murdoch,
Yes.
which I read last night, and buried within the article was something that I had forgotten. But in the 1980s, under the Reagan administration, the U.S. government quietly dropped the requirement that any licensee of the public airwaves, whether it be radio or television, had to adhere to something called the so-called Fairness Doctrine, which meant that if they were going to present one side of a story, opinion-wise, they had to present the other side, which, of course, dropping that requirement gave birth to the likes of Fox News. And that was the whole point of this article, is that after having pressured the Reagan administration to allow that requirement to be dropped, Murdoch had created this right-wing news machine that has evolved into what it is today. So it used to be that in the early 80s or late 70s, if people wanted to go to the public airwaves or watch the CBS nightly news or the ABC nightly news, they could at least be relatively assured that two sides to the story were going to be presented. And that's no longer the case. And I think the vast majority of viewers don't know that there used to be a fairness doctrine, and perhaps think that what they're seeing is the fair and balanced reporting of both sides, and that's a big contributor to this so-called fake news environment.
There's no control anymore.
None.
When I remember sitting with my father in the 1940s, listening to the BBC News in order to track exactly what was going on in the Second World War, and having absolute faith that one was listening to the truth all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And now truth doesn't mean what it used to mean.
No, no, it does not.
It's so difficult to choose where to get your information. My selection of sources has gradually evolved over the last few decades, so that I now depend entirely on the Financial Times, the Economist, which I think actually have a commercial relationship, and the Times Literary Supplement, to get anything I need to know. And these are sources that I believe I can trust. And they have amazing coverage, but all the time I'm talking to people on campus and in other social nodes in the area, who are getting their information from elsewhere, and you never quite know what is in their minds as they talk to you about things that you think you know about.
But this article was particularly disturbing because it was clear that not the singularly focus on Murdoch, but it was clear that what he's decided to do is to weaponize the news in order to make money on it, and then perpetuate through his cycle, if you will, building up candidates who agree with that kind of political leaning, who will continue to shelter him and allow him to do what he does to continue to make more money. And the payment that extracts on the society is one of just a complete slant in belief and understanding and perspective of the so-called quote unquote news. It's very disappointing.
Yeah, and I think the most important thing about this is that information is so closely related to social interaction, and so the way we interact with each other now, in much greater numbers than ever before, with so much more in our level of awareness, and what we think is the correct or realistically valid context in which we're talking, has meant that everything that has to do with human life is now has a different quality from what it had before the World Wide Web. And we really haven't even begun to think about how this should be managed. And of course, there's all sorts of other factors as well, which we have talked about, such as language, the fact that so many more people can communicate in a single language now, such a much larger proportion of the world population than ever before is able to communicate within a single language.
Well, it's interesting because I think, and I'm thinking back as you're talking, 20 years or so ago, back in that era when you sent the first email message that you sent across campus, I do not think that people viewed the development of the World Wide Web or technology or email as anything more than just simply an extension of personal communication freedom that people have had, almost like an enhanced long-distance phone system kind of mentality. I know I certainly didn't, but what happened is then interposed very quickly were these for-profit operations that I didn't envisage back in the late 1980s, that were able to create themselves and slot themselves in as intermediaries of my access to the internet and to the harvesting of information that I would normally rely on. So I sort of missed that. But I think maybe as a whole society, we collectively miss that as well. So now we're faced with what we're faced with, these gargantuan organizations that have their own slant, their own spin, and their own money-making goals.
Well, from the beginning of the past century, and certainly from the end of the Second World War, we had got used to the idea that we were living through a period of accelerating technological progress, innovation, but we'd assumed it just makes life easier, and we got used to being able to fly around the world and that sort of thing. What happened with digitization and the World Wide Web was something that completely changed the quality of everything for the first time. Instead of just accelerating and increasing things that we were already used to being able to do, which had started with the introduction of railways a century ago, and then, or a century and a half ago, and then the automobile and so on.
Well, let me ask you from a historical, contextual perspective. Now that this genie is out of the bottle, what happens next? We can't put it back in to the bottle.
I think, well, what I've been thinking about for a long time, and I probably said it in one of our sessions before, is that what it means to be human is changing. And as we move from being a member of a national community, which didn't even become an integrated national community until relatively recently, because people lived in different parts of the country, even in England, let alone in America, and had very little interaction with people in other parts of the country. And even the organization of elections was barely done within a really national context. Now, the fact that we're everything we do is part of a social hub, which is so enormous, means that the way we think about each other is very different. We all have very different relationships because relationships get diluted. If you've got relationships with 1,000 people, they're going to be very different from the relationships you had before with 10 or 20 people. And what your experience is different, and your level of awareness is different. And so far as I can see, this is going to continue to develop, and it's going to make the difference between our species and the other species with whom we evolved completely different. Think what happens when we start taking excursions to the moon or Mars, which doesn't seem to be that far off.
No, so this simply is another evolutionary aspect.
It's just that it's much more obviously qualitative than the simply quantitative changes that we were used to before.
Well, that's very interesting. We'll have to try to figure out a way to determine whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing, because it's certainly happening.
I think we have to not think in terms of good and bad, because we can't stop it anyway. We have to think in terms of how to make the best use of it.
Fair point.
And as we were saying earlier, before we began our discussion, that we can look now at the difference between life in the largest city in the world, which is a city of 37 million in Tokyo, and Philadelphia, which is a city of 5 million in the United States.
And there are significant differences between the two. Yes. Well, all right, Professor Spooner. Thank you very much on this beautiful spring day.
Yes.
I hope you enjoy it.
Finally.
Yes. We'll look forward to our next session next week. Thank you very much.
Great.